After the tornado, I sent my 16-year-old daughter to stay with my parents while I stayed behind to help as a doctor. "There's no room," they said, and left her standing outside. My sister and her 3 kids live there rent-free. I didn't shout, I acted. 2 weeks later, they were the ones panicking. My name's Danielle Price, I'm 36 years old, and I'm an ER doctor. The day it all changed started not with a bang, but with a wail. The thin, rising cry of the tornado siren cut through the humid Oklahoma air, and just like that, the world went sideways. For the next 36 hours, my universe shrank to the size of our hospital's emergency department. It was a world defined by the constant, low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the sharp, layered smells of antiseptic, blood, and the damp, earthy scent of rain-soaked clothes. That hum was the soundtrack to my life, a steady, buzzing pressure that I'd learned to ignore, a noise that meant I was doing my job. I moved from one gurney to the next, a blur of practiced motions and calm commands. Setting a broken arm for a terrified teenager, stitching a deep gash on a firefighter's forehead, holding the hand of an elderly woman who kept asking for a husband who hadn't made it. My own house was damaged. A neighbor had texted me a picture of a massive oak branch sticking out of my roof. Water was probably pouring into the attic, but there was no time to think about that. There was a line of people out the door, all of them needing something, and I was the one who had to provide it. My only real worry, the one that gnawed at the edges of my focus, was my daughter, Harper Price. She was 16, whip-smart and stubbornly independent, and I'd sent her to the one place I thought was an unconditional sanctuary, my parents' house. Their home was 20 minutes away, untouched by the worst of the storm. It was the designated family fallout shelter, the place we all went. During a 2-minute break, leaning against a supply closet door, I finally clutched my phone. My fingers were stiff and my whole body ached with a fatigue that went bone deep. My thumb hovered over her name, a desperate need to just see the word "okay" text back at me. I needed to know she was safe. That was all that mattered. The call that came wasn't a text. It was Harper, and her voice was small and tight, squeezed by an emotion I couldn't place. "Mom, they won't let me in." The words didn't compute. They were nonsense syllables against the backdrop of beeping machines and shouted orders. I pressed the phone harder to my ear, trying to filter out the familiar chaos. "What do you mean, honey? Did you knock? Maybe they can't hear you over the storm." A part of me was already bracing, a cold knot forming in my gut. "I've been knocking for an hour," she said, her voice starting to tremble. "I'm on the porch. I can see them through the front window. Grandma's in the kitchen. Brianna's kids are on the couch." Brianna, my sister, and her 3 kids had been living there for over a year. The house was full, yes, but not that full, not for family, not in a crisis. "Harper, listen to me," I said, my voice dropping into my doctor tone, the one I used to take control. "Put Mom on the phone." There was a shuffling sound, a muffled argument, and then my mother's voice, sharp and clipped. "Danielle, this just isn't a good time." "What do you mean it's not a good time?" I asked, keeping my voice low and urgent, the chaos of the ER fading into a tight, focused roar in my ears. "There's a tornado warning. Harper is on your porch." I could picture it perfectly, the wide, covered porch where Brianna and I had spent our summers, now a place of exile for my daughter. "Brianna's kids are all worked up from the storm," she said, her tone defensive, unyielding. "There's just no room." No room, the words hung in the air, absurd and monstrous. No room in a 3-bedroom house, a house whose mortgage I had been helping pay for the last 5 years. No room for her own granddaughter, my daughter, while a storm raged. I tried to reason with her, to appeal to some sliver of maternal instinct I had to believe was still in there. She was immovable. "We're just too full, Danielle. I'm sorry, she can't stay here." The line went dead. She had hung up on me. For a single, terrifying second, panic tried to claw its way up my throat. My daughter was alone on a porch in a severe storm, locked out by her own grandmother. But years of medical training, of facing down life and death in 30-second intervals, had built walls against that kind of panic. You don't feel, you solve, you triage the problem, and you act. My mind cycled through the options, a mental checklist of safe harbors. There was only one. I scrolled through my contacts, my thumb shaking slightly, and pressed the name of my Aunt Paula Price, my dad's sister. She was the family's quiet port in any storm, the one who listened without judgment and helped without fanfare. She answered on the first ring, her voice calm and steady. "Danielle, are you okay?" "I saw the news." I explained the situation in clipped, professional sentences, stripping out the emotion, hiding the tremor in my own voice. I reported the facts as if I were describing a patient's symptoms. "Harper is at my parents' house. They will not let her in. She needs a safe place to wait out the storm." There was no hesitation in Paula's response. No questions, no judgments about my mother or Brianna. Just a simple, immediate solution. "I'm on my way. I'll call you when I have her." It took her 20 minutes to drive across town. 20 minutes where I stitched a man's arm and tried not to think about my daughter shivering on that porch. Then my phone buzzed. It was Paula. "She's with me. She's safe. I'm making her some tea." I hung up, leaned my forehead against the cool, painted cinder block of the hospital corridor, and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The adrenaline that had been pumping through me for the last 36 hours vanished, leaving a hollow, echoing cold in its place. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was clarity. A switch had flipped deep inside me, a quiet click that changed the entire wiring of my world. The fight was over. The long, exhausting negotiation for my family's love and basic decency was done. I pulled out my worn leather wallet from the pocket of my scrubs. It was the one I used for everything, for groceries, for copays, for the automatic monthly transfers that propped up my parents' lives. I looked at the cracked leather, the faded seams. A decision had been made. There was nothing left to discuss. My shift finally ended 12 hours later. The sun was rising, painting the bruised sky in shades of gray and pale pink. I drove through streets littered with downed branches and debris, but I didn't go to my own damaged house. I went straight to Aunt Paula's. The moment I saw Harper curled up on the couch under a quilt, the relief was so intense my knees felt weak. I knelt down and hugged her, burying my face in her hair, just breathing her in. She was safe. That's all that mattered. Later, after Harper was asleep in the guest room, I sat at Paula's worn oak kitchen table with a mug of coffee I didn't taste. The adrenaline was gone, and in its place was a cold, hard resolve. I made the first call. My dad answered, his voice groggy. I could hear the tinny sound of a game show in the background. They were just watching television. I didn't waste time on small talk or accusations. "Dad, I need you to listen very carefully," I said, my voice as steady and even as if I were delivering a diagnosis. He mumbled something, confused. I told him that since they didn't have room for my daughter, it was only fair that I reevaluate my own space, my financial space. "The $1,200 for the mortgage won't be coming this month," I said. "Or any month after this?" There was a heavy silence on the other end of the line, thick with disbelief. Then he started sputtering. "Danielle, what are you talking about? You can't. Your mother, she was just stressed. You know how she gets with Brianna's kids." I cut him off. "She had a choice," I said, the words coming out as cold and sharp as glass. "You both had a choice. You stood there and you watched her lock your granddaughter out in a storm. You chose. Now I'm choosing." I hung up the phone before he could argue, before his weakness could try to chip away at my resolve. The click of the phone ending the call was a sound of finality. I took a deep breath and immediately made the next call, this time to the health insurance company. The hold music was tinny and awful, a cheerful little tune that grated on my raw nerves. It took 20 minutes of navigating automated menus and answering verification questions, but finally I was speaking to a real person. With a few simple sentences, I removed my parents from my family plan. The customer service representative didn't ask why. To her, it was just a transaction. "That change will be effective immediately," she said. The monthly cost was $680. A significant sum that was now, suddenly, my money again. Next, I opened my laptop on Paula's table. I logged into the state university's tuition portal, a website I knew all too well. My sister Brianna had been taking one online class a semester for the past 3 years, a slow, meandering path to a degree I was bankrolling. I found the section for recurring payments, the one scheduled to cover her upcoming fall semester. I clicked cancel. A small pop-up box asked, "Are you sure?" I clicked yes without a moment of hesitation. Each action felt clean, precise. It felt like snipping a series of threads, cords that had been wrapped around my neck for years, pulling tighter with every demand, every manufactured crisis. This wasn't revenge, it wasn't an act of anger, it was a correction. It was a balancing of the scales that had been tipped against me for my entire adult life. My worn wallet sat on the table beside my laptop. For the first time, it felt like it truly belonged to me. It took less than an hour for the backlash to begin. My phone rang and my mom's name flashed on the screen. I let it ring for a moment, then answered and put it on speaker, letting her voice fill the quiet kitchen. It was as shrill as I knew it would be. "What have you done?" she shrieked, no hello, no preamble. "We just got an alert about the insurance. Your father told me what you said. After everything we've done for you." I didn't say anything. I just let her yell, listening to the familiar cadence of her outrage. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain. There was nothing to explain. When she finally paused for a breath, I said one sentence. "You left my daughter on your porch during a natural disaster." Her sputtering silence lasted only a second before she switched tactics from rage to guilt. It was a well-worn path. "Brianna will have to drop out of school." "Her dreams, Danielle, how could you do that to your own sister?" I felt nothing. The emotional levers she was pulling were rusted and broken. "Brianna is 33 years old," I said, my voice a flat line. "She can get a job." She started crying then, accusing me of trying to make them homeless, of being cruel and ungrateful and cold-hearted. The words that used to slice me to the bone just glanced off. "You showed me exactly what your love is worth," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I'm just adjusting my budget accordingly." Then I ended the call. The next few days were quiet, deceptively so. I threw myself into practical things, focusing on Harper and getting contractors to look at the hole in my roof. We stayed with Aunt Paula, a bubble of calm in the storm of my own making. I thought naively that maybe the silence meant they understood, that they had accepted the consequences. Then a call came from my cousin, Sarah, my mom's niece. "Hey," she said, her voice laced with an uncomfortable sort of sympathy. "I just got off the phone with Aunt Linda. Is everything okay?" She sounded really, really upset. I knew exactly what this was. The first move in a new game. I decided then and there that I would not play by their rules. I wouldn't be vague or emotional. I gave Sarah the simple, unadorned truth. They refused to let Harper take shelter in their house during the tornado, so I've stopped paying their bills. There was a beat of silence on the other end of the line. "Oh," Sarah said, her voice suddenly flat. "Well, she didn't mention that part." Of course she hadn't. This was their new strategy, a campaign of half-truths. They would tell everyone I had cut them off but conveniently omit the single, monstrous reason why. They were carefully crafting a narrative, painting me as the cold, wealthy doctor who had suddenly, capriciously, abandoned her poor, struggling family. Another cousin called later that day, then a family friend from their church. Each one had heard a slightly different, more dramatic version of the story. In one version, I was angry about a forgotten birthday. In another, I was trying to force them to move into a nursing home. The lies were multiplying, spreading through the family grapevine like a virus. I felt a prickle of deep, burning annoyance. They were trying to corner me, to use the judgment of our extended family to shame me into backing down. They couldn't control me with money or guilt anymore, so they were trying to control me with public perception. This wasn't just about money, it was about controlling the narrative, and I was their villain. Brianna made the first public move. It was a Facebook post, so vague it was almost a work of art. "So sad when family forgets where they came from," she wrote. "Some people get a little bit of success and think they're better than everyone. Praying for those with hard hearts today." It was textbook passive aggression, just vague enough for her to deny it was about me if confronted, but pointed enough for everyone who knew our family to understand exactly who she meant. The comments started rolling in almost immediately, a flood of sympathy and support, all for her. Thinking of you, so sorry you're going through this, sweetie. Family should always come first. It was a masterclass in manipulation. My mom jumped into the comments section with a string of crying face emojis, adding fuel to the fire. I watched the performance from my phone, my stomach tightening into a hard knot. They were so good at this, at playing the victim. Harper came and stood behind me, reading over my shoulder. "Mom, they're lying," she said, her voice filled with a 16-year-old's outrage. "You have to say something, you have to tell people what really happened." I hesitated. Engaging would be messy, it would drag me down into the mud with them, but staying silent felt like an admission of guilt. This was their courtroom, and they had already presented their case to a jury of our friends and relatives. I realized my silence wasn't a dignified choice, it was a vulnerability they were actively exploiting. My phone, once a lifeline, became a source of constant anxiety. Every buzz, every ping could be another relative calling to check in on me, which was code for lecture me on my filial duties. My Uncle Robert, my mom's brother, left a long, rambling voicemail. His tone was one of deep disappointment, as if I were a child who had colored on the walls. He told me I was disrespecting my elders and tearing this family apart. The words were so familiar, a script I had heard my whole life. "Your mother is a good woman, Danielle," he'd said, his voice thick with unearned authority. "She has a good heart. Whatever this is, you need to apologize and you need to fix this." They never asked for my side of the story, not once. They had heard my mother's carefully edited version, and that was enough for them. Her performance of the wounded matriarch was more compelling than any truth I could offer. It was infuriating. I was being tried and convicted by a jury of people who refused to hear from the defendant. I was the villain in a story they had all agreed upon. The pressure was immense, a physical weight on my shoulders. It was even worse seeing how it affected Harper. She became quieter, more withdrawn, watching me with worried eyes. She was seeing how I handled the onslaught, how I stood up or failed to stand up to the bullies. I wasn't just fighting for my own sanity anymore, I was modeling for my daughter what it means to demand respect, to refuse to be a doormat. I had assumed this could be a clean break, a simple financial transaction. I was so wrong. This wasn't a transaction, it was a war of attrition. I finally understood the full scope of the problem. It wasn't just my parents and my sister. It was an entire family system, an intricate web of relationships built on the unspoken rule of enabling my parents' behavior. For years, I had been the good daughter, the successful one, the responsible one, the one who never made waves and paid for everything with a smile and a checkbook. My refusal to play that role anymore hadn't just angered them. It had broken the entire system, and the system was now fighting back to restore the old order. The stakes were no longer just about a mortgage payment or an insurance premium. My reputation, the way my own extended family saw me, was being systematically dismantled. But more than that, my relationship with Harper was on the line. I had to show her that standing your ground is the right thing to do, even when it's the hardest thing to do. If I caved now, if I gave in to the pressure and the public shaming, I would be teaching her a terrible lesson. That bullies win if they just yell loud enough. That your own well-being is less important than keeping toxic people comfortable. The smear campaign was their move. They had put me in check. Now I had to make mine. I couldn't let them control the story any longer. The truth was my only weapon, and it was time to use it. Brianna escalated things. She must have felt emboldened by the wave of online sympathy. She posted a long, tearful story on Facebook, complete with a carefully selected, sad-looking photo of her kids. In it, she wrote about her ungrateful sister, the big-shot doctor, who had decided her family was no longer good enough for her. She spun a tale of how I'd cut them all off out of the blue for no reason, leaving them on the verge of losing their home. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. She even mentioned her dream of finishing her degree, a dream that was now crushed because her cruel sister refused to help any longer. The post was shared dozens of times within a few hours. Friends of theirs, people I barely knew, started leaving angry comments directed at me even though I wasn't tagged. Some people are just heartless. I can't believe a daughter would do that to her own mother. This was it. This was the first piece of hard, public evidence of the lies they were spreading. It wasn't just whispers over the phone anymore, it was a written accusation for the whole world to see. I read her words, paragraph after paragraph of self-pity and outright falsehoods, and the last shred of my hesitation vanished. They wanted a public fight. Fine, they would get one. I didn't write a long, emotional response. I didn't get into a back-and-forth argument in the comments. I refused to play their game. Instead, I opened my online banking app. I scrolled back to the previous month's transactions and found it, the mortgage payment. I took a clean screenshot. It clearly showed the date, the amount $1,200, and the memo I always included, Mom and Dad mortgage. It was cold, hard, and undeniable. For a moment, I considered also screenshotting the text message from my mother, the one where she'd said, "There's no room," but I decided against it. That felt too personal, too dramatic. The bank transfer was enough. It was clinical. It was a receipt. I went back to Brianna's post. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding a steady, heavy rhythm in my chest. Then I scrolled down to the comment section and attached the screenshot of the mortgage payment. I wrote only one single, clear sentence above it. This is the abandonment. This is the payment for the house my daughter was not allowed to enter during a tornado. I will not be discussing this further. Then I logged off. I didn't wait for the replies. I had lit the match and dropped it. The bridge of playing nice and staying quiet was now a pile of smoking ash. My phone started blowing up within minutes. The screen lit up with a relentless barrage of texts, missed calls, and Facebook notifications. I ignored them all. The only call I answered was from Aunt Paula. She didn't ask what I'd done, she already knew. "Good for you," was all she said, and her simple validation felt like a shield. I logged back on an hour later just to see the damage. It was significant. Some of the angry commenters on Brianna's post had quietly deleted their messages. A few brave souls, friends of mine who had been silent until now, started asking Brianna to explain the screenshot. My cousin, Sarah, the one who had called me first, sent me a private message. I had no idea. "I am so sorry." The tide was turning. Brianna, seeing she had lost control of her own narrative, deleted my comment, but it was too late. Dozens of people had already seen it, screenshot it, and shared it. The truth was out. An hour after that, she deleted her entire post. The sudden, glaring silence was more damning than any argument could have been. My mom called me then, her name flashing on my screen again and again. I let it go to voicemail. My dad sent a text, "You've embarrassed this whole family." I typed back one sentence, "You embarrassed yourselves when you locked your granddaughter out of your house." The ticking clock in my head wasn't for their apologies anymore. It was for the first of the month. The day the mortgage was due, they had 1 week. My new approach was crystal clear. I would only engage with facts. No emotion, no drama. I wouldn't justify, argue, defend, or explain anything. That was their world, a chaotic mess of feelings and accusations where the loudest, most pitiful person won. I wouldn't live there anymore. My decision to go public, even in that small, precise way, was a pivot. I was no longer playing defense in their messy game. I was setting my own terms on a brand new board. The most important thing was that Harper saw the whole thing. That evening, as we were making dinner at Aunt Paula's, she came and stood next to me. She looked at me with a new kind of respect in her eyes. "You were a total boss, Mom," she said quietly. That single sentence was worth more to me than the approval of 100 misinformed relatives. I realized this was no longer about just escaping a toxic dynamic. It was about dismantling it. My family had always operated in the shadows of assumption and unspoken guilt. I had just turned on a very bright, very unflattering light. There was no going back to being the silent, accommodating daughter. that person was gone for good. A few nights later, Aunt Paula came over to my now-repaired house with a casserole and a bottle of wine. We'd finally moved back in, and the quiet felt strange but good. After Harper had gone to bed, Paula poured us both a glass of red wine and looked at me from across the kitchen island. "You know," she said, her voice thoughtful, "they've done this before." I was confused, and I must have looked it. "Done what? Kicked someone out?" She shook her head. "Pulled the rug out," she clarified. "Your Uncle Robert, the one who left you that nasty voicemail, years ago, he and his wife were between houses. Their new place wasn't ready and they needed somewhere to stay for a couple of months." She explained that my mom and dad had offered them their spare room. Robert and his wife were thrilled, relieved, but a week before they were supposed to move in, my mom called them. She told them it just wouldn't work out. The reason? Robert's wife had mildly disagreed with my mom about something petty, the best way to make potato salad, or something equally ridiculous at a family dinner. My mom had used the housing situation, their moment of vulnerability, as leverage to punish her for not towing the line. Robert and his wife were humiliated and had to scramble to find a tiny, overpriced apartment. And to make peace, to get back into my mother's good graces, Robert ended up siding with my mom and apologizing for his own wife's disrespect. He's been firmly on her side ever since. The story hit me like a physical blow. It was like a key turning in a lock I didn't even know existed. This whole situation, this entire agonizing ordeal wasn't about me. It wasn't about Harper being an inconvenience. It was a pattern, a tool. I started connecting the dots, years of confusing and hurtful moments suddenly snapping into a sharp, ugly picture. The way they'd always pit me and Brianna against each other, praising one while criticizing the other. The way they'd offer help that always came with invisible strings, a debt you would be called on to repay at the most inconvenient time. Their love, their support, it was all conditional. It was a currency they used to buy compliance and maintain control. The major world-shifting truth was revealed. I wasn't dealing with a family who had made a terrible, out-of-character mistake in a moment of stress. I was dealing with people who used calculated cruelty as a tool to manage their relationships. My entire life, I had been running on a hamster wheel, trying to earn the unconditional love of people who were fundamentally incapable of giving it. My success as a doctor, my financial stability, it was never a source of pride for them. It was a resource to be exploited, and my quiet, constant compliance was the price of admission to the family. The moment I stopped paying, I was exiled, just like Uncle Robert's wife had been all those years ago for questioning a potato salad recipe. It was a stunning, sickeningly clear revelation. I picked up my phone, my hands strangely steady. I went to my contacts and scrolled down to my mom's name. I stared at the screen for a long time, and a wave of grief washed over me, not for the mother I had, but for the mother I wished I'd had. The one who would have opened the door without a second thought. Then I pressed block. A confirmation popped up asking if I was sure. I was. I did the same for my dad and for Brianna. It was a quiet, simple act on a small, glowing screen, but it felt like a monumental, irreversible choice. This wasn't a temporary timeout. This wasn't a negotiation tactic. This was an amputation. The financial cutoff had been a tactic, a response to their action. This was different. This was the real severing. I was no longer waiting for an apology or hoping they would see the error of their ways. I was finally, completely accepting them for who they were and removing their poison from my life. The choice to build something new wasn't just a slogan I could repeat in the quiet of my head and then forget. It had to be practical. It had to be the work of my life for the foreseeable future. I sat at Paula's kitchen table that night with a notepad and a pen, and I made a list that felt less like a poor doctor's budget and more like a battle plan. "We're going to have an emergency fund," I wrote. "We're going to have a roof that isn't held together by guilt and automatic transfers. We're going to have rules about who gets to speak into our life. No more enabling calls at midnight. No more bailouts that come with emotional invoices." I called the bank and set up a separate savings account in Harper's name and started the transfer of the $1,200 I would have sent my parents into that account. It felt like an act of care, money where it would do the most good, not money that would be weaponized the next time someone decided my life needed rearranging. I made a list of priorities. Save for Harper's college, fix the part of the roof that would leak again next winter, set aside a small cushion so we wouldn't have to swallow our pride and ask anyone else for help. None of those things sounded glamorous. None of them erased the grief, but they were steady, honest steps forward. That morning I told Harper exactly what I had done. I watched her face as I spoke, no theatrical shock, just the steady, centered young woman she was becoming. "I've blocked them," I said. "I cut the payments, it's permanent." Her hands were folded in her lap like they always are when she's thinking. Then she smiled, a small thing that made my chest unclench. "Good," she said. "We can breathe." She meant more than the air in her lungs. She meant the kind of breathing you do when the weighted blanket of other people's drama is finally lifted off you. We started to pick our life apart and put it back together in the ways we could control. We chose a realtor and walked through small houses until one felt like less cost and more future. We set up a bedtime routine that didn't involve scrambling when someone called. We made a rule: if a problem involves our safety, we call Aunt Paula. If it's anyone else, we solve it ourselves. It was the simplest boundary, but it felt like armor. I also started saying no in other parts of my life. No to overtime that would let me disappear into work to avoid feeling. No to social engagements that were really just family gossip sessions disguised as kindness. I knew this new life wouldn't be a clean break. My parents had decades of habit and a social network ready to paint me as the villain. They would shout my name in living rooms and in pews and over phone lines until their throats were hoarse. But the goal wasn't to make them see the light. The goal was to build a place where Harper could be safe and where I could come home and not feel drained by the tax of other people's expectations. It was a bold, sometimes lonely plan, and it felt righteous in a way I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. I felt ready. I also felt vulnerable. That vulnerability is the price of doing anything real. I was not naive enough to think they'd simply fold and go away. If anything, by pulling the plug, I'd lit a flare in a tinderbox. They had shown me they preferred public performance to private decency, and I suspected they'd use whatever stage they could find to make me the villain. I told Harper that if they tried to make a scene, we would not run, we would not cower, we would be quiet and true and present. She squeezed my hand and I could feel how hard she gripped back. "Just us," she said. It was simple and it was everything. A week later, the test came. I was 3 hours into a double shift, fluorescent lights humming, fluorescent glare bouncing off the linoleum in the manner that always made everything look too sharp and too small. The emergency department was a rhythm of its own, the steady beep of monitors, the rustle of gowns, soft curses muttered under breath when equipment refused to cooperate. I had just finished suturing a deep cut when Jenna, one of the nurses, stepped into the doorway with that look, the one you get when you have bad news that belongs to someone else. "Danielle, you've got visitors," she said, voice low. "They're in the waiting room." My stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with the shift. I pushed my gloves off and walked out into the waiting area. The air there smelled of coffee and the faint antiseptic that clung to everything in this place. And there they were, Mom, Dad, and Brianna, all of them arranged like a tableau meant to be noticed. Mom's face was wet from crying, too perfect to be entirely authentic, my skin told me, and she had a paper plate in one hand, as if she'd been playing the part of the defeated mother while passing out casserole dishes at a church supper. Dad hovered behind her, hands shoved into pockets, eyes fixed on the floor. Brianna had her phone up as if she were recording for an audience. The kids were somewhere near, half embarrassed, half thrilled. When Mom saw me, she didn't walk toward me in a small voice. She launched. Her tone was loud, shrill even, echoing off the high ceiling. "There she is," she called. "My daughter, the rich doctor who's throwing her own parents out on the street." Heads turned. For a moment, the waiting room fell into that strange silence that happens when a private fight is made public and everyone becomes unwilling witnesses. It felt like they'd walked into my workplace with intent to destroy the one place I still felt safe. Brianna stepped forward with an angry, practiced look. "We just want to talk to you, Danielle," she said, voice too even to be sincere. Her phone jutted out in front of her like a shield. Mom started listing grievances, cataloging health complaints and expenses as if the crowd were a jury and she was laying out the evidence. "Your mother can't afford her medications now. You cut us off without warning," she said, eyes scanning the faces around her for allies. I kept my voice slow and controlled because everywhere here, this fluorescent temple of crises professionalism is an anchor. "This is a hospital," I said evenly. "This is my workplace. It's not the place for this conversation." The words didn't land. Mom ignored me and raised her voice. "You won't answer our calls. You've abandoned your family." Security started to move toward us, the familiar shuffle you feel in your chest when authority edges into a volatile room, and for a beat I knew the entire event would escalate into something that no one, not the patients in beds or the parents in the waiting room, needed. I held up a hand, not in pleading but to stall. I couldn't let them make it worse. "I need you to leave," I said, looking at Mom as calmly as I could. "You're creating a disturbance in an emergency room. Please step outside." Her face contorted first into fury, then a theatrically wounded look. For a split second, I thought she might lunge, whether to touch me or simply to make me flinch. Brianna's recording angle sharpened like a knife. People around us were whispering and shifting in their seats, the small, prying eyes of a community spectacle. They left eventually, escorted by a security guard who walked them to the sliding doors with the careful, slow patience of someone who does this too often. As they went out, Mom turned and shouted something about shame and how I would pay. The words followed them like a shouted benediction. I watched them go, my face calm, my hands still, but inside my chest the familiar tightness had flared up like a blister. The place I had counted on as an escape, my shift, my work, the only domain where my competence wasn't questioned by relatives, had been violated. An hour later, I was called into Mark Jennings' office. Mark was an administrator at the hospital, the sort of man who kept his tie just so and his phone on silent except for family calls. He'd known my parents for years, the kind of neighbor relationship that meant casual visits at church and fundraisers. He looked like a man pulled between loyalty and policy, and he was sweating that small, polite sweat that people do when they're about to try to fix something by pretending it was never broken. "Danielle," he began, closing the door with a soft click that felt loud in the tight room. He spoke slowly, careful not to stumble on the words. "I had several calls earlier from your mother, and you know how word gets. There's talk among the staff. I wanted to check in." His voice had that gentle rebuke of someone who wants to be seen as reasonable while still nudging you toward a more comfortable solution for everyone else. I listened. He offered sympathy to my parents, the sort of automatic empathy people give family members in distress, but then he pivoted. "We need to be careful about how this looks to patients," he said. "This is a place where people come to be cared for, not to witness family drama." He suggested softly that perhaps I could find a way to reconcile. "You're such a valued member of our team, Danielle, maybe you could call them." "Maybe you could talk." He framed it as concern, but it sounded like an expectation. "Make it right, keep the peace, don't force us to pick sides." The warning hung in the air. He wasn't asking me to break policy or lie. He was asking me to return to the role I'd always been cast in, the one where I absorbed the discomfort of others so the institution could remain tidy. I felt the room tilt. Gossip in a hospital spreads fast, and if the administration was nudging me toward reconciliation, the staff would take the cue. Maybe tests would be read a little slower. Maybe pager beeps would be ignored with polite smiles. I felt the taste of betrayal and professional risk on my tongue, a metallic tang that made my hands clench. I kept my voice steady. "This is not a private matter," I said. "They came into my workplace and created a scene. I won't allow the place I take care of strangers to be used as a stage for family vendettas. I didn't tell him about the blocked numbers or the canceled payments. I told him the simple truth. He nodded, sympathy creasing his forehead, but I could see the wheels turning. He wanted an easy fix. I had given him none. As I left his office, the fluorescent hum felt different. It wasn't just the background noise of exhaustion anymore. It was the sound of a life I'd chosen to keep separate, slowly leaking into the place I chose to heal others. The stakes had risen. Their campaign had moved from social media and potluck pity to my professional realm. I knew I had to brace for more, but the weird, fierce clarity I'd felt when I stopped answering their calls held steady. This new life I was building for Harper and me wasn't negotiable. Not at my workplace, not in a waiting room, not anywhere. The phone lit up with an unknown number late one night, the kind of number you never answer unless you know you have to. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in my chest tightened and I hit accept. His voice came through slurred and small, wrapped in the kind of shame that smells like cheap beer and old regrets. "Danny," he said, and for a second I heard the old, warm timbre I used to know, then it cracked. "You gotta fix this." He was drunk. I could hear the clink of ice and the tinny hum of a television he shouldn't have been watching. "Dad," I kept my voice even. When you say his name in a certain tone, he tends to listen. "What's going on?" "Mom, she won't eat, she's crying, the notice came today." "The bank's taking the house." His words tumbled out as if he'd rehearsed them in the bottoms of bottles. For a bad second I felt guilty, the old reflex that I should patch everything because I had always been the fixer. But the memory of Harper on that porch flashed through my mind and the guilt was gone. "Why didn't you call me before?" I asked, because people at that moment always try to make it my fault. He started begging, the kind of pleading that used to make me fold back when I was younger. "Please, Danny, just put the payment back on, just the house, that's all. We'll figure it out." The voice was small and pathetic in a way that hurt me. For a beat I felt something like pity for him, a flicker of the man who had taught me to throw a baseball and who smelled like motor oil on Saturday mornings. Then I heard the raw edges of desperation and the truth began to slip out of him like a thread from a worn sweater. Dad's next words were quiet, the kind you only hear when alcohol thins the usual defenses. "It was Brianna," he said, and then he named it as if he needed to get the secret out before the bottle swallowed it again. It was terrible, bitter, and so small I almost laughed, if laughter could be called anything but shaking. He told me how they'd told Brianna Harper was coming and she'd thrown a fit harder than I'd ever seen her throw at family dinners. She'd said, "If you let her in, I'm taking my kids and leaving. I won't be giving you grandchildren anymore." It was blackmail dressed up like a tantrum, a child making a threat that suddenly had adult consequences. I listened, and the pieces clicked into a frame I didn't want to see. Brianna had made it an ultimatum, her grandchildren or Harper. My parents, who'd always feared the smallest fracture in their little social world, had folded. They'd chosen the path of least resistance, the one that kept their living room the way it always was. My own daughter had been locked out of her grandmother's house because my sister wanted to prove a point. The absurdity and cruelty of it made my stomach roll. I held the phone so tight my knuckles were white. "Why didn't you say something?" I asked, not to him so much as to the room, to the ghost of every time they'd let someone else dictate their behavior. He made some noise, a cough, a hitch of air, and then admitted in a voice that sounded small and tired that they were scared of Brianna's theatrics and the mess that would follow if she left. He told me how he and Mom had always avoided conflict like it was a contagious disease, and how fear of losing the grandchildren had outweighed the safety of the one granddaughter on the porch. The admission fell like a stone in my chest. I had been hoping, perhaps foolishly, that Dad had been a bystander, that his heart might still be mine in some quiet corner. That hope shattered. He wasn't a bystander, he'd chosen. He was part of what had happened, not some innocent pawn caught in a sibling war. "I'm sorry you're in this position, Dad," I said finally, my voice almost steady. "But you made your bed." There was nothing else to say. He started to plead again, to promise anything to get the bandage back on, but I cut him off. "Goodbye." The line went to silence. The drunk, ragged apology sounded on playback in my head, but I didn't unmute it. I couldn't. I sat there with the phone dark in my hand and felt a cold certainty settle over me. Hope had been a weak currency, and I just cashed the last of it in. I called Paula before I let myself fall apart. Her number was a lifeline I still had left. She picked up on the second ring like she always did, her voice steady and practical. "Tell me everything," she said. So I did. I told her about Harper on the porch. I told her about the text that had been cut off by a slammed door. I told her about the phone call where Dad, alcohol making him looser and sadder, had admitted that Brianna had issued an ultimatum and they'd folded. Paula listened without flinching. When I stopped, the kitchen clock on her wall ticked loudly for a beat too long. She was quiet for a minute and then said, "The rats are turning on each other." The way she said it was not unkind. It was a simple observation from someone who'd watched families eat themselves for years. "They're going to lose the house," she said. Her voice didn't rise, she stated it like a fact. I told her about the notice. Paula swore softly and then, with no drama, started laying out a plan. Her tone was that of someone who'd helped people move out of bad situations more than she'd complained. I felt some small relief at her inventiveness. We talked for an hour, not about revenge but about options. Practical things, the bank, a tidy amount to clear the loans, a way to give Mom and Dad a little money so they could find an apartment if they chose to leave the house. Paula suggested something I hadn't expected, an offer to buy the house from them, not out of spite but as a way to stop the foreclosure and give them an option that wasn't living on the edge. "I'll make you an offer," she said. "The house will be paid off, they'll have some cash for a place to rent. It won't be charity if it's paid for properly, it will be a transaction on fair terms." It was risky. It was also an olive branch that came with boundaries. Paula said it would have to be on paper, formal, something that required them to sign and accept. They would have to swallow their pride and accept that the family home could be sold to someone they already trusted. They would have to choose survival over stubbornness. They could keep what dignity they had and walk away with a little security, or they could toss the papers in the trash and prove they'd rather be homeless than accept help from me. I felt the cold logic of it. Paula's offer would save them from living under a bridge of shame if they took it. If they refused, they'd have no one to blame but themselves. We sketched the terms in simple language. Paula would offer enough to clear the bank's demand and leave a small amount for first and last month's rent somewhere modest. She'd put the offer in writing, signed it, and go by their house to present it face to face. It had to look like help, not punishment. It had to be calm and practical because any hint of triumph would make Mom tear the papers in half on principle. Paula promised to be firm but gentle. "No sermon," she told me. "Just the facts, the check, and a polite deadline. If Mom and Dad accepted, they'd keep a roof. If they refused, the bank would take it and they'd lose more than a house. Either way, I wasn't stepping back in to prop them up again." There was a strange sense of relief in that plan, like setting a fence before a storm. I wasn't trying to win them back. I wasn't trying to punish. I was offering a clear, quiet way out that did not require me to be their bank any longer. It felt like the only honest thing to do. If they wanted to be stubborn and proud in a one-room apartment full of memories, that would be their choice. If they wanted the dignity of a financial handshake and the chance to start over, I'd help them in the way I'd help a patient who'd refuse treatment unless you made the choice simple and unavoidable. Paula's voice was steady on the phone as we closed the plan. "I'll go tomorrow," she said. "I'll bring the paperwork and the offer. If they refuse, it's their decision. We won't be chasing them down. We'll let consequences speak." I hung up and for the first time in weeks felt something like calm. Whatever happened next, I had done everything I could to offer a way forward that wasn't backsliding into the old, dangerous patterns. I went to bed that night feeling exhausted but oddly light, like the muscles around my chest had finally loosened a bit. The rest of it, the fallout, the refusal, whatever humiliation they might throw at me, would have to come. But at least I'd built a bridge and handed them the map. Whether they'd walk across it was up to them. Aunt Paula drove over the next day with the paperwork folded into a neat, legal-looking packet and a calm I envied. She walked into their little living room like she was delivering a casserole, not an ultimatum. Mom and Dad were sitting at the kitchen table, cups of coffee gone cold, faces pinched with a kind of stubborn pride that makes people do dangerous things. Paula sat down without fanfare and explained the terms. She spoke in simple sentences, steady and plain. She would buy the house, pay what needed to be paid so the bank wouldn't take it, and leave them with enough money to find a modest apartment. It was not charity, it was a business deal, an honest offer with boundaries. She slid the papers across the table and handed them a pen. I watched from the doorway, arms folded, the air around me thin and hot. Mom picked up the packet, thumbed a corner, and for a moment I thought she might read. Then she tore the first sheet in two, hard, like ripping a photograph of something she refused to admit was broken. The paper fell to the floor, fluttering like a small white flag that no one would pick up. "I'd rather be homeless than take charity from her," she declared, voice bright with theatrical hurt. Dad stood behind her, hands on the back of a chair, not defending, not arguing, just steady and silent. He wouldn't say a word in Paula's defense. He wouldn't make any move to take the pen. The look on his face was one I'd seen my whole life, a mix of fatigue and the habit of avoiding storms at all costs. 2 weeks later, the bank's paperwork arrived. The foreclosure was messy and public, and somehow both immediate and slow at the same time. Movers came and packed boxes into a truck that smelled of dust and old sweat. They left the house with their faces turned toward the street, dignity intact in the only way Mom knew how, by turning anger outward and blame toward me. They moved into a cramped apartment on the wrong side of town, the kind of place with thin walls and a landlord who did urgent repairs only after several threatening phone calls. Brianna and her kids squeezed into 2 small bedrooms that had once been my parents' spare rooms. They put up pictures of the old house on the new apartment's beige walls like a talisman, as if you could glue the past into a new place. When they settled, the story shifted. Mom and Brianna went about the work of rewriting the narrative. They told family and church friends that I had orchestrated the foreclosure, that I had frozen them out, that I'd intentionally engineered their ruin. It was easier to say I had pulled the lever than to admit they'd refused the offer on principle. Old allies nodded and sent messages of sympathy. The lie grew teeth. It was repeated in kitchens and during coffee hour until it had the shape of the truth for anyone who wanted to believe it. I had tried to offer them a bridge, something practical that might save what could be saved. Instead, they'd turned my hand extended in help into a weapon they could use to paint me as cruel. The defeat felt sudden and absolute, like falling through ice and finding the water was deeper than you thought. The hardest part of all of it was watching Harper. I had hoped that cutting ties would protect her, that removing the toxic current would calm the water for her to swim in. Instead, the current found her. She came home one afternoon with her eyes hollowed in a way that made my stomach flip. A cousin had sent her a screenshot of Mom's post, a public accusation with a layer of righteous hurt wrapped around it. "Mom," she said when she walked in, voice small, "they're saying you made them lose the house." Her fingers twisted a strap on her backpack until the fabric creased. She looked 10 years younger than 16 in that moment. That night I overheard her on the phone, voice barely a whisper. "It's my fault," she told a friend. "If I'd gone somewhere else, none of this would have happened. Maybe I shouldn't have asked to come here." The sentence hit me like cold glass. My old internal script, the one that always assumed my choices carry responsibility for everyone else's happiness, had worked its way into my child's voice. It felt like a betrayal by my own wiring. I had stood before hospitals full of people who needed me and held firm. But here, with the people who had actually hurt her, my decisions had ripple effects that landed on her shoulders. I sat on the edge of her bed and waited until she was off the phone. The room smelled faintly of lavender from a candle she'd lit earlier. She folded her hands and stared at the floor. I wanted to fix it the way I fix a broken bone. Set it straight and tape it up, but this was not a place for sutures. Hey, I said, keeping my voice low, come here. She crawled under the blanket like a small animal seeking warmth. I wrapped my arms around her and felt her shiver against me. This is not your fault, I told her again, though I'd said it a dozen times already. Her face pressed into my shoulder, breath warm and uneven. But they lost their house because of me, Mom, she whispered. I was the problem. Maybe if I'd stayed home, it wouldn't have happened. I stayed with her through the night and told her stories that weren't about blame. I told her about Uncle Robert, about the potato salad argument that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the way Mom uses power. I told her about Paula, about small acts of kindness that don't demand a receipt. I explained as simply as I could that sometimes people make choices based on fear and pride, not on fairness or safety. They chose to protect the version of themselves they liked, I said. They chose performance over the simple, ugly work of being decent. Her fingers found mine in the dark and squeezed. So it's not my fault, she said, the words like a slow, careful climb out of a hole. We talked for hours in a way I hadn't let us talk before, no rehearsed lines, no polite evasions. I told her the truth about why I'd stopped paying, that their refusal to let her in had been the final, undeniable proof that what they offered as love came with a price tag. I told her I had tried to help them in a way that would not make me complicit in their habits. She listened and sometimes nodded and sometimes asked questions that made my throat tighten. If they won't change, she asked, will you still be sad? I admitted I would always carry grief for the family I thought we had. But sadness and safety can live in the same house, I told her. We can be sad and still not be unsafe. By the end of that long night, something fragile took root between us. Harper's voice wasn't the broken whisper it had been. There was a steadier note now, as if the truth had given her a kind of strange permission to breathe. We have each other, she said finally, like a small oath. That's what matters. It was a simple sentence, but it meant she believed me in a new, deeper way. I felt my chest unclench, not entirely, but enough that I could breathe without panic. We had one another, and that was a hard-won fact that no one could take away by posting or by tearing papers in front of a family friend. It didn't fix everything. It didn't bring back the house or the pictures or the old holidays. But it meant we were building something that would be ours, piece by careful piece. A month later, an invitation popped up on Facebook that felt like a sucker punch. The community support barbecue was organized by a church group and framed as a fundraiser for the displaced Price family. The event description was careful, full of pieties and hashtags and the small, public language of pity. It read like a carefully arranged stage set. Tables, paper plates, and a script that cast Mom and Brianna as victims and me as the villain who had struck the final blow. My first instinct was to ignore it, to stay home and protect the fragile peace we'd cultivated. I thought of the quiet evenings with Harper and Paula's casseroles on Sunday, and I wanted to keep our life away from the heat of that show. Harper, though, surprised me. She sat at the kitchen table, earbuds in, and scrolled through the event page until she read the details. Then she shut her laptop and looked up at me with an expression that made my heart stop with both fear and pride. Mom, she said, we should go. I blinked. What, are you serious? It's a trap, they'll make it about us. She shook her head. No, it's public. If we hide, they'll win. If we go and just sit there, they'll have to look at us and know we didn't do what they say. We can get a plate of food, see some people, and leave. Showing up is a kind of truth. Her plan was disarmingly simple and braver than I felt. It wasn't about confrontation or vindication. It was about presence, about refusing to disappear the way they'd tried to make us disappear. We made a small pact: we would go, but we would not engage. No speeches, no lectures, no social media fights. We would be quiet and unblinking. We would be the inconvenient, ordinary people who had nothing to hide. I agreed, partly because it was the right kind of resistance and partly because Harper's courage made my own feel possible. On the day of the barbecue, I ironed a plain blouse and watched Harper pick out a jacket that didn't try too hard. We practiced a small script in the car, what we'd say if someone approached, how we'd keep our voices calm. My hands were oddly steady as we turned into the church parking lot, the smell of frying burgers hitting us like a summer memory. People were milling around under a canopy of folding tables and a banner that read "Support for the Price Family" in cheerful block letters. The music dipped when we walked in like a soft intake of breath. For a breathless second, the whole thing hung in the air, ready to explode into confrontation or collapse into the ordinary. Harper squeezed my hand and we stepped forward together. We walked into the church park and the whole place shifted. The music thinned out like an inhale. Conversations paused. People turned toward us the way someone turns when a flashlight hits a face in a dark room. My stomach tightened for a second, then Harper squeezed my hand and I felt steadier. We had promised each other we would not argue, not perform, not let them drag us into the theater they'd set up. My mother saw us and the color leaked out of her face. She came at us like a storm she'd been saving up for, face wet with 2 perfect tears, the paper plate in her hand forgotten. Brianna was close behind her, eyes narrowed, phone up like a witness. The kids hovered near the folding tables, wide-eyed. "I can't believe you have the nerve to show your face here," Mom hissed, loud enough for the half-circle of people near the food to hear. Her voice was low but hard. She wanted an audience and a verdict. She wanted people to watch her perform the injured party. I kept my voice flat like I do when I want to diffuse a patient in the waiting room. "Hello, Mom," I said. "This is a community event. We're part of the community too." I kept my shoulders loose and my hands visible so no one could call me aggressive. Harper stood at my side, chin up, not a hint of the hollow girl who'd come home pale a month ago. Mom's lips curled. "This is for the people you hurt," she snarled. "The family you destroyed." She scanned the crowd, calling for witnesses. A few heads tipped forward, the ones who'd come to the barbecue with a ready story to repeat. I could see the calculation in her eyes. She wanted people to lean close and watch me shrink. I didn't give her that. I let my calm be the thing people noticed. "I didn't destroy our family, Mom," I said, louder now so the people closest could hear. "I just stopped being its sole source of funding." The words landed flat and clean, no pleading, no explaining, just a fact. She scoffed and tried to drown me out, but not everyone was buying it. A woman from the church I recognized, Susan Miller, who'd taught Sunday school when we were kids, shifted, looked at Mom and said, "Linda, maybe let's not do this here." It was the kind of small, public rebuke that carries weight because it's polite in tone but firm in effect. The murmurs that followed were not all in my favor, but they were quieter than I'd feared. Brianna stepped forward, phone still raised. "You think you can just cut us off and walk away?" she asked, trying for that high, wounded register that had rallied so many people. "You think you can ruin people and then hide?" She looked for the crowd to cluck and sympathize, but a few people glanced at her and then looked away. You could see the strain of the usual gossip balancing against the sense that maybe something else was going on. Harper squeezed my hand and said nothing, but her face told a story, scared, yes, but also untouchable in a strange new way. She'd seen the receipts, the texts, she'd watched me set boundaries and stand by them. She'd learned in small, painful lessons that truth sometimes looks plain and unlovely and still wins. Mom kept at it, louder now, trying to twist the narrative into a direct accusation. "You sent us a notice. You made us lose everything for petty revenge," she called. The claim hung there, dramatic and simple. I took a breath and let the silence fill the space for a beat before I answered. Silence had become a weapon as sharp as anything the family could throw. I let the things I had done speak for me, the screenshot of the mortgage payment in the comment, the canceled tuition, the removed insurance. Those were factual airdrops in the war of stories. I didn't recite them again, I didn't need to. The first month had the receipts circulating quietly through people who mattered. A cousin had called, another friend had asked. The internet had been a blunt instrument, but in this room faces had already been set. Some people had heard both sides by now. A man near the grill, someone who'd been friendly with Dad for years, cleared his throat and said, "Isn't the point of a church that people help each other?" His tone wasn't accusatory toward my mother, but it made the crowd consider what help looks like. A few people shifted, some looked uncomfortable. The scene lost its saloon-style momentum. I looked at Mom and said one thing, slow and steady, so it landed like a verdict. For 20 years I paid for what you needed. My voice didn't shake. I paid the mortgage on this house. I paid for your health coverage. I paid for Brianna's college. I never said no when you asked. I paused. People were leaning in, not because they wanted drama, but because they were hearing things they'd never been told. All I ever asked for in return was one thing. I kept going. That if my daughter needed shelter during a tornado, you'd open the door, you locked it. You chose Brianna's tantrum over my daughter's safety. The words felt heavy but accurate, raw but clean. I watched Mom's face go pale. She had no script for this. She'd always had a script that let her shape the narrative. Now the script had a tear in it. The crowd was not cheering, but it shifted. Murmurs moved from my mother's circle out into the park. I saw Susan Miller, whose hand had been on Mom's arm a moment before, now looking down, a small, sad pity on her face. People turned toward her like they were asking, silently, whether they'd been misled by the first performance. A woman from the church stepped up then and offered quietly, "We all love families here. Maybe it's best we don't air things like this at a community dinner." It wasn't a total dismissal of Mom's pain, but it kept the heat from the circle. The murmurs dissolved into a more human sort of conversation about what it means to be kind and also honest. Mom's mouth worked. She had no real rebuttal because the rebuttal would have been admitting the truth, and her truth was performance. Brianna's phone wavered in her hand. A few neighbors who'd been primed by her posts sat looking uncomfortable as the story they were repeating unraveled in front of them. There was one last thing I said, the final stitch to close the chapter. I kept my voice low so it carried without theatrics. Everything that's happened since, the money, the house, the lies, it's a consequence of one choice. I looked at Mom the whole time. You closed the door. The line was simple. It left no room for the usual cloud of excuses. No one could argue with the fact that the door had been closed. She opened her mouth and shut it. For the first time in my life, I saw my mother without a script. She looked small. Her energy had been a machine of performance and manipulation for years. Without that machine, she had nothing but fury that had nowhere useful to go. Someone in the crowd, an older woman who'd known my family for decades, said softly, "Maybe we should let them be." It was as close to a judgment as anyone in that group would give. Eyes shifted away from my mother and Brianna, little gestures of social distancing that felt like a slow exhale. I took Harper's hand and we started to walk away. There was nothing left to say. The world had heard facts and seen the stage and mostly chosen in a quiet way to favor the facts. We left with no dramatic victory dance. There was no gloating, only the steady, ordinary motion of two people heading home. After that day, the noise faded, not all at once, but enough that we could hear our own thoughts again. 6 months later, the leaves were turning, and the new house we'd found felt like a small, guarded miracle. It was smaller than the old one, but brighter. The windows let in light the way some houses keep it, like a secret. There were no pictures on the mantel from the house that was gone, no reminders of a living room where rules were enforced like currency. We had space to spread out, to make new habits, to set the plates down without the whisper of debt. We didn't get calls from Mom or Brianna. Aunt Paula told me they were still in the apartment and that Brianna had finally found a part-time job doing bookkeeping at a small store. Paula's voice carried no relish when she told me. She called it practical. I felt no triumph or glee. What I felt was distance, clean and wide and final. Holidays were quieter. There was an empty place at the table where old rituals had been. Some days I felt the ache of that absence, the way you feel a bruise after you've bumped it, dull and present but less sharp than it had been. The cost was visible. There were things I missed that I hadn't known how to name. The softness of Mom's afternoon voice, the easy jokes Dad used to tell at Sunday barbecues. There were moments when I would watch another mother and daughter in a grocery store and a small, hot grief would flare. Grief was a real part of this new life, but it no longer dominated. It was a scar, not an open wound. What filled the space now were the small, steady things. Evening routines with Harper, homework at the kitchen table, her head bent over a laptop, the soft glow on her face. Weekend hikes where we learned new trails and didn't worry about someone calling to ask for money. Aunt Paula and her husband stopped by on Sundays with casseroles and gossip about their garden. Paula had become, in ways I hadn't allowed myself to hope for, the parent figure I needed, a steady, honest presence who asked nothing I couldn't give. We carefully rebuilt our life with the money I'd set aside. The savings account for Harper became a real safety net. We fixed the part of the roof that wanted to leak, we bought a washer that didn't rattle like a tired old animal, and we paid for tutoring when Harper needed it. Those were practical things, yes, but they were also the daily acts of care that made our home feel safe. For the first time in a long time, I came home and didn't feel like I had to brace for an emergency call about someone else's feelings. One night, a thunderstorm rolled in, just a normal Midwest storm, not a tornado, and everything felt different about the sound. I was on the couch with Harper, the TV a muted background, a blanket over our knees. The lightning slashed the sky and the thunder rolled through the house like a big, rolling drum. In the past, storms had made my mind race with work calls and relatives in need. This time, the storm felt like a close, honest friend. We were safe inside. The rain made small rivers down the gutters. The smell of wet earth crept through the window when the wind opened it for a breath. Harper leaned her head on my shoulder and said, "I'm glad we moved, Mom." "I like it here." Her voice was soft, content. She sounded younger than her 16 years, the way kids sound when they're not carrying the heavy air of grown-up dramas. I realized my phone hadn't buzzed with a guilt message all weekend. The quiet was not empty now, it felt full. Full of jokes, of plans, of things that belonged to us and not to anyone else's ledger. At nights, Paula and her husband come for dinner every Sunday. We cook together, laugh about nothing, trade recipes. Paula is a steadying force who asks for nothing and gives what she can. Those dinners are a kind of therapy, food and presence, and a place to say the small, true things out loud. We talk about Harper's college plans, about the new maple tree we planted in the yard, about whether the neighbor's dog will ever stop barking at the mail truck. What surprised me most was how my idea of family changed. It used to be about blood and obligation, a ledger with entries and expectations. Now family is about who shows up and who keeps showing up. It's the person who opens the door when you're soaked from the rain, not the one who keeps score. It was a lesson I taught Harper, not by lecture but by practice. We had rebuilt the idea of family from scratch, with strangers who'd become friends and with an aunt who folded casseroles into aluminum pans and left them like small acts of faith at our door. I finally bought a new wallet, small and unfrayed. When I slid my new insurance card into its slot and looked at the neatness of it, the sense of control didn't sting the way the old wallet once had. It was lighter. My life wasn't tidy by any means, but it was ours. One night I watched Harper study at the kitchen table, her face lit by the laptop screen, and felt in my chest a deep, quiet rightness. I'd saved my daughter from a bad situation, and I'd saved a piece of myself in the process. Closing that door on the people who refused to open theirs had cost me a family, yes, but it had also given me a home. Thank you for listening. If you've ever had to make a hard choice to protect your peace, share your story in the comments. I read them. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next episode.